I like to use that as a way of conveying what I mean about the scriptures. Because when you're studying the scriptures, you need to know, essentially, you need to know what were the verses behind and what were the verses ahead. What was the chapter behind? What is the chapter ahead? So why do I bring this up? Because we're pointing immediately to Hebrews chapter 8. We jumped to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. But you have to see a whole book in context. So what is going on in Hebrews? The book of Hebrews, and I'm not going to try and get into who wrote it, all this kind of stuff, but essentially, the book of Hebrews was written to people that were living in Jerusalem, either up close to the destruction of the temple, or I personally believe shortly after the destruction of the temple. And the book of Hebrews reads like an answer to what would become Judaism's prime question of the first century. The prime question, actually, it was Judaism's prime question since the captivity in Babylon, the Babylonian captivity. The prime question is this: how do we, quote, do Judaism without a temple? What are we going to do without a temple? And the book of Hebrews seems to be written in a way that is addressing that question. How are we going to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob without a temple? Now, let's just assume that I'm right here for a second, okay? Let's just assume that the book of Hebrews was written to answer that question. I'd like to take it a step further. And the step further is this: who was the audience of the book of Hebrews? Or what audience did the author of the book intend? Well, I would like to suggest to you that the book of Hebrews, and I think it's a pretty easy case to make, was clearly written to a group of Jewish people that were followers of Yeshua. Now, let's link these 2 points together, okay? Because we might be onto something here. I think we can all agree easily that the book of Hebrew was written to Jewish believers of Yeshua. Fine. If you're struggling with me on the second part, just go with me here for a second. Let's just assume that the book was written post-destruction, very shortly after the destruction. What does that tell you about the faith, the Jewish faith of the believers in Jerusalem who were following Yeshua as it related to temple observance? Well, it tells you that they followed the temple observances. They were still sacrificing animals. They were believers in Yeshua who maintained the sacrificial system. These were not believers in Yeshua who went around teaching that the Torah was abolished by Yeshua's death, resurrection, and ascension. They were not believing that. These were Jewish people who were still sacrificing. They were still following the Torah in the context of their faith in Yeshua. Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly why our little group has to grow and has to become very important. It has to grow and it has to become important because we are trying as best as we can, and we do have a lot of information, as best as we can, to resurrect that first century Judaism mentality that could accept Yeshua and accept Torah. Now, we're doing it in a little bit more complicated era where we have modern Judaism, of which I'm a part of, and Christianity, which some of you all are a part of. And we're trying to resolve that and integrate those notions in the backgrounds that we come from. Okay, enough on that. Let's turn to Hebrews chapter 8. Last week in 2 Corinthians, I noticed it and I pointed it out, and this week I'll point it out again. But the first sentence of 8 is critical. Now, the main point in what we are saying is this. Okay, you don't get these kinds of goodies often. So when the author of the book is telling you this is the main point, this is a time to really sit up and pay attention, because something massive is coming. Now the main point in what we are saying this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary and the true tent that the Lord and not any mortal has set up. Okay, so let's just break this down. Number 1, he's telling you what the main point is. Number 2, what is the main point? We have a high priest. This, for me, gives me evidence that this book was written, or at least this section of the book was written post-destruction. That it's kind of like, what are we going to do? We lost our temple. We have no more Kohanim. We have no more Levites. What are we going to do? And the author of the book says, wait a minute. We're believers in Yeshua. We have our Kohen Hagadol. We have our high priest. Let's continue. Where is he? He's not here on earth like the Levites were on earth. And look at what happened with the Levites. They became corrupted. They were misappropriately put into office by Roman and Greek governors. They were wrongly elevated. So the Levitical system was in chaos. It was a disarray. So the earthly one was pretty much a failure. And I don't mean to, it's just kind of a reality that they were a failure pretty much since the beginning of their priesthood. They were not really an effective priesthood. What are you talking about? That's crazy. Read 2 Kings, 1 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, read the prophets. The priests were not able to hold Bnei Israel together when these kings would go off track. That was part of their function. So the earthly Levitical system was not very good. And Shaul intimated to that in 2 Corinthians 3 when he was comparing old and new. Okay, where is our high priest? He is seated at the right hand on the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister in the sanctuary, the true tent. The true tent. The better word there would be tabernacle, the true tent or tabernacle. And this is definitely a reference to the Mishkan, and we're already seeing that Shaul is going to start to draw his points here. So let me I'll just keep that right here for a second. Let me continue. For every high priest is appointed, to offer gifts and sacrifice. Hence, it is necessary for this priest to also have something to offer. Now, if we here on earth, if he were here on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. So, Shaul's going to make some very... All right, I kind of gave it away that I believe Shaul wrote this, but that's neither here nor there. But Shaul is going to kind of start, again, making his midrash about the heavenly priest and the earthly priest. And he's going to start making these comparisons. And he's going to start talking about the gifts. Let's pick up in verse 5. They offer worship in a sanctuary that is a sketch of shadow of heavenly one. For Moshe, when he was about to erect the tent, was warned, see that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. Verse 6, but Yeshua has now obtained a more excellent ministry, and to that degree he is the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted through better promises. For if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no need to look for a second one. God finds faults with them when he says, the days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their ancestors on the day I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant, and so I had no concern for them, says the Lord. Of course, that's quoting Jeremiah. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my laws in their mind, write them on their hearts. I will be their God, they will be my people. They shall not teach one another or say, know the Lord, for they shall know me from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. Verse 13, in speaking of a new covenant, he has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and growing old will soon, not now. Here, Yeshua is already resurrected and in heaven, and the old one is still in effect, will soon disappear. Okay, so let's start talking about some things here. Let's open up with a couple of questions. What is new and what is passing away as you read through chapter 8? Keep that in mind. The next thing I'd like to point out is I want to start bringing in the Melchizedekian priesthood. The first time we meet Melchizedek is back in Genesis 14. He was the king of Salem who brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest of the God Most High. Then, continuing in Psalm 110 verse 4, it says, the Lord has sworn, and he will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So taking a look at this psalm, I want to ask you the question, who is the you here in the psalm when it says, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek? Well, it's David's son. It's about the Messiah, Yeshua. So a lot of people think that Psalm 110 is talking to David. He is in a sense, but he's really talking about Yeshua himself, because in Matthew 22, you can look that up. I give the cross-reference there, 41 to 46. You can see that Yeshua is actually claiming that. Now, the next question is this. Was David a priest? This is an important answer. A lot of folks say yes, a lot of folks say no. I would like to suggest to you that David was a very unique individual. He was a very unique individual. How is he unique? Well, I would like to say and suggest that David served 3 offices at the same time. He was a prophet, he was a king, and David was also a priest. Well, David doesn't come from Levi. How can he be a priest? Very reasonable question. Let's continue. Let's take a look at 2 Samuel, verse 6. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, we can see that David wears an ephod and functions as a high priest. So the fact that David wore an ephod, and he, as we'll see here in verse 17, he made sacrifices and offerings to the Lord. It says in 2 Samuel 6, 17 and 18, so they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent, which David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. 18, when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, that very famous Levitical, the Aaronic benediction, most likely is what he blessed them. And David was very much functioning as a priest. We can see in 17 and 18, he offered the burnt offerings and he blessed the people in the name of the Lord. I need to make that bold there because that section there. But it continues in 2 Samuel in chapter 8, verse 18, where we can see that David's sons were chief ministers. Now, this is an interesting translation that the translators in the New American Standard Bible chose to use the word ministers there. It's very likely that they chose to use that word because they couldn't reconcile the fact that the Hebrew word there was kohanim, which translates to priests. So I think what we're trying to do here, what I'm trying to do is nicely paint a picture for you that David and the line that comes from David, meaning David, David's sons, and ultimately Yeshua, is a lineage of priests. But the question is, are they Levitical priests? Well, or are they Melchizedekian priests? Let's take a look at 1 Chronicles. In 1 Chronicles, chapter 15, 27, we see, now David was clothed with a robe of fine linen, with all the Levites who were carrying the ark. Again, you got to see this in the Hebrew a little bit, or at least read it in the context. But the priest, the clothed with a robe of fine linen, is essentially coming from Exodus, the priestly garments, and more specific, the ephod, which was this gown that the priests would wear. And you can see, continuing, that David was clothed with a robe of fine linen, meaning the priestly garments or the ephod, with all the Levites. So David was standing there with all the Levites who were carrying the ark. Again, he was in this priestly position. Okay, so this is important as it relates to Hebrews chapter 8. Now, let's jump back to Hebrews chapter 5. And in Hebrews chapter 5, which is a couple of chapters before chapter 8, the author starts writing in Hebrews chapter 5, every high priest chosen from among mortals is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness. So you could see in chapter 5, Shaul is starting to talk about priesthood, and he's comparing earthly priests, and he'll soon be comparing heavenly priests. And you can see that the earthly priests are priests that are themselves subject to being having weaknesses and having all sorts of human issues, right? And which is why we know that they themselves have to make atonement for themselves once a year.
You with the Jewish?
Yeah, we're broadcasting right now.
Oh.
So come on and have a seat. And we'll catch up after this.
Okay.
Good. So we just had a visitor walk into the room, so that's good. We're in Hebrews chapter 5. And we're taking a look at the writing of the comparison of the priesthoods. Let's pick up in chapter 3, Hebrews 5, verse 3. And because of this, he must offer sacrifices for his own sin as well as for the sin of the people. Verse 4. And one does not presume to take his honor, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So again, we could see here in 5 that the earthly priesthood had its limitations and its weaknesses. Now the author of Hebrews, again I think is Shaul in chapter 5, starting in verse 5, begins to introduce the role of Mashiach, begins to introduce Yeshua's part in this. And he says, so also Mashiach did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but he was appointed by the one who said to him, you are my son, today I've begotten you. That's coming from Psalms 1. As he also says in another place, you are a priesthood forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And we just went over that in Psalms 110. So we could see that in the Psalms, when it's saying, quote, you are a priesthood forever according to Melchizedek, that here in Hebrews 5 and in Matthew, that was referring to Yeshua himself. Let's take a look at a couple of other verses. But before we do, I always wanted to, this is kind of an obvious question. And, well, to be quite honest, I've never heard it come up anywhere. And anybody really address this pretty obvious question. So I think it's pretty clear that everybody agrees that the priesthood comes from the tribe of Levi. I mean, right? Nobody would argue that. What tribe does Yeshua come from? He comes from the tribe of Judah. Right? He comes from the line of David, from the son of Jesse, Yishai. How come nobody ever said, wait a minute, how can the line of Judah, where Yeshua comes from, who is ultimately going to be a high priest, what happened to the Levites? Well, I don't think that question went unnoticed in the first century, because clearly here in the book of Messianic Jews, or the book of Hebrews, the author is clearly addressing that. And what I've done here is I've laid out several verses, in Hebrews 5 and 6, ultimately leading to chapter 8, where Shaul is essentially saying that Yeshua is of the Melchizedekian priesthood order. And what he's doing is he is pointing out in chapter 8, so 5, 6, 7, leading to chapter 8, what Yeshua is ultimately doing is he is pointing out, like he did in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, he is pointing out, he's doing a comparison of the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, and in chapter 8 of Hebrews, he's like really digging deep into that, and he is making that comparison now of the two priesthoods. And I went ahead and I threw together this chart here comparing the priesthood of Aaron, who Shaul was, or the Levite priesthood of the tribe of Levi and Aaron, with the second priesthood, who is Melchizedek, David, and ultimately Yeshua. So this chart here kind of sums up the point of chapter 8. So in 8, 1 to 12, again, Shaul comes straight up and it says the main point. Again, any time in the Bible when somebody offers those words, this is the main point, we need to sit up and really look, because this is rare when they say this. The main point, what is the main point? We have such a high priest. And he goes on to essentially say in chapter 8, verses 1 to 2, that Yeshua is our high priest who is in the heavenly tabernacle. That's the whole point. Again, why is that the point? Because here are Jewish believers in Yeshua in the first century who are living at the time either right up unto or shortly, as I believe, shortly after the destruction of the temple. And these Jewish believers who were believers in Yeshua still maintained temple service. They didn't say, oh, we believe in Yeshua, we don't have to do this anymore. No. They understood what it meant to be Jewish, believing in Yeshua, and follow the Torah and celebrate the temple practices. They never had those notions that, Yeshua did away with this and that. So they were in kind of a panic, because they had to say, what are we going to do? And the author of Hebrews comes out and says, wait, listen, the temple is destroyed. We don't have our Levitical priesthood, but we got something better, and that is Yeshua. That is Yeshua. And that's what's happening in chapter 8, verses 1 to 2. Then we come down to Hebrews 8, verses 3 through 7, and we start getting that comparison. The Levitical priesthood, Aaron, they're on earth. The Melchizedekian, Davidic, and Messiahship of Yeshua, not on earth. Aaron, tribe of Levi. Melchizedek, tribe of Judah, not Levitical priests. It's a copy of it, or a shadow, the author of Hebrews says. Melchizedekian, Davidic, and Yeshua priesthood, that's the reality of what the shadow was, essentially the image it was portraying was the ultimate reality, that Yeshua is our high priest. So verse 6, he kind of continues, and he says, this is the reality. It's a more excellent ministry. Yeshua is our mediator. Now, I'd like to take a few seconds and talk about the word mediator, because I've always been taught that Yeshua was an intercessor, but not a mediator. That in order to go to God, we needed an intercessor, somebody who goes on our behalf. The Bible really doesn't teach that. The Bible definitely teaches that we need a mediator, but it doesn't say we need an intercessor. Well, what's the difference between a mediator and an intercessor? The difference between a mediator and an intercessor is that a mediator brings two groups to the table. And he says, hey, you guys, come on. You guys have a conflict. Let's work this out together. Why don't you talk to your brother? Why don't you talk to your neighbor? Let's work this out. And a mediator comes to bring peace between two groups. As far as the ministry of Yeshua, that he's our mediator, he comes between Israel and God, and he is making the peace. He's saying, come on, I'm going to facilitate this peace between you two. An intercessor basically is an agent that speaks on behalf of the group, and you're never allowed to talk to the other party. So if Yeshua was an intercessor, we would have to pray to Yeshua. Yeshua would go to God. The Father would come back to Yeshua. Yeshua would come back to us. And we would have no direct access to our Heavenly Father if Yeshua was truly an intercessor. But that's not the case, right? Shaul says we should approach the throne of grace with boldness. We come to our Heavenly Father's throne of grace boldly. Why? Because Yeshua is right next to him there, not intercessing, but mediating. We have direct access to the Father. because Yeshua is mediating. It's a very subtle difference, but it's a very important difference. Verse 6 continues where Shaul introduces us to the concept that it's a better covenant enacted on better promises. Then Shaul makes a review of the Old and New Covenant. One is ineffective. One has the Torah on the heart. Essentially, that the glory of Messiah is veiled in the Old Covenant. In the New Covenant, the glory it's the mark of our faith. The Old Covenant is not one of faith. The New Covenant reveals Yeshua's glory. Okay, now what I'd like to do here, which is pretty interesting, is to dig a little bit deeper into verse 7. Of chapter 8. And I always say, beware of the translators, because in verse 7, there's a little kind of a sneaky thing going on, and the translators kind of editorialized, or they made their own little comment. They snuck it in there. Verse 7 in the New American Standard reads, "For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no need to look for a second one." I'll say it one more time. It says, "For if that first covenant." Well, this is a great verse for people who want to essentially teach that the first covenant, meaning, in their mind at least, that the Torah is done, it's obsolete, because it had faults, and we needed a second one. Well, if you examine the Greek manuscripts and actually take a look at what it says in the Greek here, the word covenant is not there. That is an insertion. The word covenant is not there. Verse 7 of chapter 8 really reads, "For if that first had been faultless." If that first had been faultless, there would have been no need to look for a second one. So if the word covenant is there, what is he talking about? Well, that's where we have to use a little reading comprehension and reread up until verse 5. Reread 1 back down to 7, and we see that verses 1 to 7 are talking about a priesthood. So in reality, what's happening is it should be read, "For if that first priesthood had been faultless, there would have been no need to look for a second one." Again, the Old and New Covenant isn't an issue of Torah. It's an issue of the material that Torah was written on. The Old Covenant was written on stones by human hands, on stones carved out by human hands. The New Covenant is the same Torah written on a heart. Who can write on the heart? Only the Ruach. God writes it on the heart. The mediators of the first covenant was a failed, ineffective Levitical priesthood. The mediator of the new covenant is an effective, glorious Mashiach of the Melchizedekian priesthood. So when we start analyzing the difference between Old Covenant and New Covenant, it has nothing to do with the Torah, but it has everything to do with what the words were written on, the material, and the mediator of the covenant. So that's what's going on in chapter 8, verse 7. And then Shaul continues, 7 and 8. And he refers to the first priesthood. As I said, the word covenant isn't really there. It's the word priesthood. The word first and them is referring to Aaron and the Levites in verses 7 and 8. And the second refers to the second priesthood. How do we know this? Because immediately after chapter 8 says, God finds fault with them. Who's the them? Not the covenant. That doesn't even make sense. The them is the priesthood. When he says, and then he just starts quoting Jeremiah again. Let's continue down to 8:13. In 8:13, it says, in speaking of a new covenant, he has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and growing old will soon disappear. Guess what? The word covenant, not there in the text. It's not there. Quite honestly, you have to ask yourself, what is the main point of Hebrews 8? Well, he tells you the main point of Hebrews 8 in 8:1 when he says, the main point is we have a high priest. Hebrews chapter 8 is not about Old Covenant and New Covenant the way it was in 2 Corinthians. Hebrews chapter 8 is about priesthoods. In chapter 5, 6, and 7 leads you up by introducing the Melchizedekian priesthood, and 5, 6, and 7 leads us up to the Melchizedekian priesthood, and chapter 8 is already laid it out there. So 8:13, the missing covenant, is again referring to the priesthood. It's referring to the priesthood. The word first was associated with the Aaronic priesthood, and that is what is obsolete, and that is what will soon disappear. The main point of Hebrews chapter 8 is the Levitical priesthood versus the Melchizedekian priesthood. That's essentially what's going on there. So over here, I've just kind of produced a full summary of ideas of the Old Covenant and New Covenant. I've got Torah on the heart, on stone and tablets in the Aaronic priesthood. Old Covenant, New Covenant, Torah on the heart, Yeshua as high priest. So again, it has nothing to do with the Torah. It again is, what is it being written on? Who is the priest? What is it being written on? Who is the priest? Ezekiel 36:26 says, moreover, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you, and I will remove the heart of stone. It's essentially where this is going. And those of us who have our faith in Yeshua firmly today, we are the first fruits of the new covenant. We adhere to the Torah, which Yeshua said he was not going to remove one jot or tittle away from. However, we see him as our Kohen Hagadol, and we see him as, through the ministry of the Ruach, writing the Torah on our hearts. A while back ago, I was able to find a Rosh Hashanah Machzor. This is a traditional Jewish Rosh Hashanah Machzor, a Rosh Hashanah prayer book. It's very rare to find them. This one was published in 1937, which actually calls out Yeshua in the Rosh Hashanah prayer when they blow the shofar, and it says, Yeshua Sar HaPanim Metatron, and it essentially translates to, by his merit should we be written in the book of life. I'm going to start to wrap up the study and leave you with somewhat of a controversial question. And I like controversial things, so I don't really shy away from them. I'm a Jewish believer in Yeshua. All I am is one big controversy. Why would God allow the destruction of the Second Temple? Well, questions like this don't have one totally complete answer. However, I would like to suggest an additional answer. Judaism essentially teaches, the rabbis essentially teach that The first temple was destroyed because of Avodah Zarah, which means idol worship, and that the second temple was destroyed because of abject hatred, that the Jewish people just hated on each other, and God destroyed the temple because of hatred. And that's, I think there's some merit to that, and there is a good lesson in that. I would also like to make a second suggestion that I don't think conflicts or contradicts with what the rabbis teach, but I'd also like to make a suggestion that God allowed the destruction of the second temple in order to destroy the Levitical priesthood, because that had to be destroyed in order to make way for the new covenant's fulfillment. There's only one priesthood, folks. Which one are you going to be under? Are you going to be under the old Levitical priesthood or the new Yeshua Davidic Melchizedekian priesthood? That's the question. Obviously, we want to be under Yeshua, who is from Judah, and who the Psalms say, and Shaul, even here in the book of Hebrews, say, is a priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek. Ezekiel 36:27 says, I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will be careful to observe my ordinances. Folks, that hasn't happened yet to the nation of Israel. That new flesh, that heart of flesh, that spirit, it's happening to us individually, but it hasn't happened to the entire nation of Israel yet. It's in process. I would suggest for you to review Ezekiel chapters 40-48, and just to make the case a little bit stronger, that in no way in Ezekiel's temple does it refer to a Kohen Hagadol there. It refers to a Sar, a prince, who appears to be functioning as a high priest. And between Ezekiel's temple and the first, second, and potentially third temple, where we know there was a Kohen HaGadol, and that we assume there will be a Kohen HaGadol in the third temple, in the fourth temple, Ezekiel's final temple, there is no mention of a high priest. The Hebrew is very clear that it only mentions a prince in those chapters who is functioning as a priest. Let's kind of continue with our comparison of the two priesthoods. So the Aaronic priesthood, the Levitical, these are not the goal or the end, but they pointed towards the goal or the end. And what was the goal or the end? What did they point to? They pointed to the order of Melchizedek, which was the reality. The Aaronic priesthood, the Levitical priesthoods, they were sinners. Yeshua, his priesthood, the Melchizedekian priesthood, are without sin. The Aaronic priests died. They were mortals. The Davidic Melchizedekian Yeshua priesthood, these are heavenly. The Levites were unable to change the heart of the worshiper. The heart could not change. Again, read 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You will constantly read of just people who were not of changed hearts, that the Levitical priesthoods were not able to change their heart. The Melchizedekian priesthood, this priesthood can change the heart. They have the ability to do that. They could not bring about the new covenant. The Melchizedekian priesthood brings about the new covenant. They cannot be both king and priest. A Levite cannot be a king and a priest. The Melchizedekian, Davidic, Yeshua can be both king and priest. So we can see the radical difference in the priesthoods. Again, verse 13 of chapter 8 points to a new priesthood, not a new covenant. The word covenant is missing from there. Now, this is what's interesting as far as it says it's becoming obsolete. Why becoming obsolete and not just obsolete, as if there was in a future time? Again, I use this point to make my argument or my case that the Levites they were still sacrificing essentially even post-destruction of the temple. The Talmud in various places suggests that there were 6 to 10 years of sacrifices after the destruction of the temple. And the Mishnah continues to talk about sacrifices without a temple. But the author of Hebrews points out that we need to be focusing on Yeshua as our high priest, Let's continue in the book of Hebrews to chapter 9. And let's start in verse 1. Now, even the first covenant, again, we are struck or bit by the covenant bug. The word covenant is just not there. You can look that up in any kind of interlinear English-Greek Bible. The word covenant is not there. Now, even if the first had regulations for worship and earthly sanctuaries. So, first what? We're talking about the first priesthood. Okay? Now, even if the first priesthood had regulations for worship and an earthly sanctuary, for a tent was constructed, the first one in which were lampstand and table and bread of the presence, this is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a tent called the Holy of Holies. And what Shaul's going to start to do is he's going to use this symbolism to make a midrash of the outer tabernacle and the inner tabernacle. What I would like to suggest to you, and what he's going to do there with this outer tabernacle and inner tabernacle, is essentially he is going to make the argument that in the wilderness of the Exodus, where God gave Moshe an image of the heavenly tabernacle, and he told Moshe to have the Israelites build for him a tabernacle patterned after the ones in the heavens. Within the tabernacle itself, within the construction of the tabernacle itself, there is a hint, there is an image of an old and new covenant. And even in the book of Exodus, with the construction of the tabernacle, we can see that God is already laying out the idea of an old and new covenant by having an outer tabernacle and an inner tabernacle. I mean, did you ever wonder, if you could look at the tabernacle from the top down, it was this huge rectangle, okay? 20 by 10, the Bible says, huge rectangle. And then inside the rectangle was a smaller little tent. Where did the sacrifices happen? The sacrifices happened in the outer tabernacle. That was where the lampstand was. That's where everything happened. The Holy of Holies, there's a little tiny tent separated by a veil, was only to be gone into once a year on the Day of Atonement. The word outer is not even there. It's the word first in the Greek. So what Shaul is basically saying isn't that there's an outer and inner tabernacle, but a first and a second tabernacle, much like there's a first and a second priesthood. The first or outer tabernacle, I would like to suggest, is a symbol for the present time. The first tabernacle is a symbol of essentially the old covenant and the old priesthood, a priesthood that cannot change the heart. Now, let's take a look at the holy place and the most holy place. Inside the most holy place, the second, this was representative of what was going on in heaven. And what was in there, that is where the ark was. This is where the Shekhinah came. This is where the Kohen HaGadol would meet before God, and the glory of God hovered above the ark. The glory of God was not in the first or outer tabernacle. Let's take a look at this a little bit more clearly. The first tabernacle was a rectangle of 20 by 10 cubits. It contained the altar of incense placed before the veil, which was before the Lord. It had a menorah, which was its only source of light. It had a table with the bread of the Hashem's presence. And according to Isaiah 1, this was where the Aaronic Levitical priesthood functioned. It pointed to that. The second heavenly inner, the Holy of Holies, this had the ark. It was smaller, and it pointed to the Melchizedekian priesthood. Here's kind of a summary of Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews 9:15 essentially refers to the Old Covenant. It's a Torah on stone. It's the Aaronic priesthood. It's obsolete and destroyed. The New Covenant is Torah on the heart. It's Melchizedekian priesthood. Yeshua is the high priest, and it represents Israel as a nation, and it is in process. All right, so that will conclude our study of the Jewish perspective on the New Covenant, and I should say the Old Covenant. I would like to thank you all for listening, and I'd like to encourage you all to email me and participate in the online discussion. You can email me down here. Here's my email address. It's info@jer31.com if you have any questions. The next study we'll be doing will be Messiah in the Tanakh. I pray for each and every one of you. I pray that you are healthy, that you are being spiritually fed, and that you are able to work and provide for yourselves and your families. May God bless you all the way around. In Yeshua HaMashiach, until next time, thank you very, very much.